Jálùbáríkà mo dúpẹ́. 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 Lolo, lolo. Ẹ̀kálẹ́ o, ẹ̀kálẹ́ o, dálàfíà ni, àdúpẹ́, mo dúpẹ́, gbogbo wa la dúpẹ́. Jálùbáríkà mo dúpẹ́, jálùbáríkà mo dúpẹ́, jálùbáríkà mo dúpẹ́, jálùbáríkà mo dúpẹ́. Ẹ̀kálẹ́ o, ẹ̀kálẹ́ o. Thank you very much. Yeah. Kilele, together, kilele, 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 kilele. Awo, awo, answer. Awo. Come on, let me hear you. Awo, awo. Mama, mama, kilele, mama, mama, kilele, baba, baba, kilele, baba, baba, kilele, awo, awo, kilele, oh, ọ̀rẹ́ ará kilele, 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 can I hear you, kilele. Sing loud, kilele. Awo, 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 awo. Mama, mama, kilele. Baba, baba, kilele. Awo, awo, kilele. Ọ̀rẹ́ ará kilele. Oh, kilele, ya. Kilele. Kilele. Awo, awo. Awo, awo, awo. Mama, mama, kilele. Mama, mama, kilele. Baba, baba, kilele. Awo, awo, kilele. Ọ̀rẹ́ ará kilele. Oge, 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 oníyà àgbàrò. Oge, ògèrèyà. Aláyé òjìire, Ifá òjìire, Ọ̀rúnmìlà òjìire. Oge, 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 ògèrèyà. Oge, ògèrèyà àgbàrò. Aláyé òjìire, Ifá òjìire, Ọ̀rúnmìlà òjìire. Oge, 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 ògèrèyà àgbàrò. Ògèrèyà àgbàrò. Ògèrèyà àgbàrò. Ògèrèyà àgbàrò. Aláyé òjìire, Ifá òjìire, Ọ̀rúnmìlà òjìire. Oge, ògèrèyà àgbàrò. Thank you.
My name is Bryant Keith Alexander. I serve as the Dean of the College of Communication and Fine Arts here at LMU, and I'm also serving as the Interim Dean for the School of Film and Television. What a wonderful evening, and thank you for joining us for what is going to be a spectacular time. On behalf of Dr. Timothy Law Snyder, President of Loyola Marymount University, It is a pleasure to welcome you to what is the inaugural Global Conversation Series, beginning with our two distinguished, highly accomplished, and beautiful scholars, Wole Soyinka and Henry Louis Gates, Jr. This evening is organized by my sister friend, Dr. Theresia de Vroom, Director of the Marymount Institute for Faith, Culture, and the Arts here at LMU, in conjunction with TSEHAI Publishers. This event is further produced by my brother, John Flaherty, Associate Director of Campus Ministry and Director of Liturgy and Music. He is the facilitator of the phenomenal musical accompaniment that we have engaged as processional, that we will engage as interlude, as recessional, and musical, cultural dialogue throughout our evening. This evening, we have the pleasure to share space and time with two of the most influential African and African-American gentle men in this country and beyond. Wole Soyinka is a Nobel Laureate, writer, activist, and former President's Marymount Professor in Residence here at LMU. Welcome back, sir. He is joined in conversation this evening with Emmy-Award winning filmmaker, prolific literary and cultural scholar, journalist, and institution builder, Dr. Henry Louis Gates, Jr. Welcome, sir. We are blessed to have them both with us this evening. Throughout their separate bodies of work, written, professed, and profound, they have offered us ways of understanding the relational infrastructure of language and culture of African and African-American peoples as both particular and plural, as historic and dynamically living and thriving. Their work is historical and contemporary, poetic and performative, critical and activist, offering us ways of seeing, knowing, and being, offering us templates of sociality in relation to our past, present, future, and with each other. To each of them, we are indebted, deeply indebted, for what they have offered the world and each of us in very personal, academic, and spiritual ways. It is the tradition at the beginning of each of these types of events on this campus to offer a prayer to further activate our time together and bring into our presence the blessings of our God. And while LMU is rooted in our Catholic faith with the informing orders of the Jesuits, the Religious of the Sacred Heart of Mary, and the Sisters of St. Joseph's of Orange, I invite you all, and through your own diverse cosmologies of faith, of religious practice and spirituality, to open up a space in your mind and in your heart, to call forth the blessings of the sun, of the moon, of the celestial ancestors to bear upon the wonder of our time together here, knowing that unrest exists in the world, and knowing that our planet is in great threat and despair. I call upon you to harness the best of your intentions, to will into being calmer spirits and peace in the world. This is my humble prayer. This is my solemn request as we give thanks for this opportunity for us to be together in peace and in promise as men and women with and for each other. Can I get an amen? Amen. Amen.
Down by the riverside, I'm gonna walk in the ways of peace. Walk with me now. Down by the riverside, I'm gonna walk in the ways of peace. All till now. Down by the riverside, I'm gonna walk in the ways of peace. I ain't gonna study war no more. 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 Gonna study war no more. I ain't 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 gonna study war no more. That comes from the tradition of the historic Negro spirituals, Black Civil War soldiers fighting for their own freedom and yet singing, ain't gonna study war no more. Well, there are many of my students, my theology students here tonight, and they're so excited that Dr. Gates is here because we've been watching all of your shows, Finding Your Roots and, the Black Church. This is our story. This is our song. And at the very end of the Black Church, Dr. Gates sings a song, and I had to look that song up. I didn't even know that one, so thank you for helping me learn a new song. Song, some people call it I Believe I Will Go Back Home. Some call it The Prodigal Son. I believe I will go back home. Oh, I believe I will go back home. Oh, I believe I will go back home and be a servant of the Lord. Well, the prodigal son, he was a forward child. Always doing wrong. You know what I'm talking about? But after he left his father's house, he thought that he'd gone wrong. So he said, well, I believe I will go back home. Oh, I believe I will go back home. Oh, I believe I will go back home and be a servant of the Lord. Oh, I believe I will go back home. I believe I will go back home. Oh, I believe I will go back home and be a servant of the Lord. Now when his father saw him coming, he greeted him with a smile, and he threw his arms around him, saying, "This is my darling child." Oh yeah, oh I believe I will go back home. Oh I believe I will go back home. Oh I believe I will go back home and be a servant of the Lord. Oh I believe I will go back home. I believe I will go back home. Oh I believe I will go back home and be a servant of the Lord. I'm gonna be a servant of the Lord. I'm gonna be a servant of the Lord. I'm gonna be a servant of the Lord. Woo! All right. Amen. 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 Woo! All right. Thank you so much. Thank you. Woo! Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's my song.
Thank you all for being here. I'm Theresia de Vroom, and this is my wonderful, brilliant colleague, Julia Lee. We're both in the English department. And part of our theme tonight will be about mentorship a little bit. So Julia was Professor Gates's best student at Harvard, which he only mentioned about 12 times this evening. It was teacher's pet, you know. And Professor Gates was Professor Soyinka's student at Cambridge in England. And I feel that one of the greatest privileges of my life is to become friends with Professor Soyinka, and has been such a great influence on my sense of what it means to be a writer or to be an artist or to have a moral sense and a core and an extraordinary relationship. So we're going to just chit-chat for a little bit, and we'll have a little bit more music, chit-chat, and then there we are. So I thought that one of the things the two of you so have in common is that you're storytellers.
Youth before age.
Was there a question
Yes,
in that?
meaning that I think that even when you write academic, you're both academics, you're both professors, you're both teachers, but when you write your academic work, and you're a playwright and a poet and a memorist, and you as well, you're always telling stories.
Yes.
And that's very different from a lot of academic pursuits sometimes, right?
Well, my father, whom Wole knew, was a fabulous storyteller. He was hilariously funny. My father was so funny, he made Red Fox look like an undertaker. And he loved stories, and he communicated in stories. And where I grew up in eastern West Virginia, everybody told stories. But if you, it's a little bit like Zora Neale Hurston when she went back to Eatonville in Florida. But first of all, Professor Harris, I had never heard the Prodigal Son sung outside of Walden Methodist Church till today. And that is my favorite hymn. The choir sang it at my mother's funeral. So God bless you for doing that. And when I was a graduate student, I was his student. I studied history at Yale as an undergraduate. Then I got a fellowship to go to the University. I got a Mellon Fellowship. I was the first African American to get a Mellon Fellowship. My father, and I called him, and I called my parents. When I was growing up, I wanted to go to Harvard and Yale, and I wanted to go to Oxford and Cambridge, because on TV, that's where they said smart people had gone. And my father's first cousin had graduated from Harvard Law School in 1949, so that was sort of in the family lore. And his wife, who was black, got a PhD in comparative literature in 1955, so that was sort of that. Then I wanted to go to Oxford and Cambridge, because Rhodes Scholars went to Oxford. And so I applied to all these fellowships. I applied to Theresia 7 fellowships.
Wow.
And I was a finalist for all these fellowships, and I wasn't getting any. I was a finalist for the Rhodes, the Marshall, the Fulbright. So my girlfriend, who was Linda Darling, some of you know Linda Darling Hammond up at Stanford. We were junior year item at Yale. And she said, just go in there and be yourself. Stop trying to pretend to be somebody you're not. So I went in, I was my own little funky self. And I got the fellowship, I got the Mellon Fellowship. And it was one of the happiest days of my life. And I went back to Calhoun College at Yale, and I called my parents, and my father answered the phone. I said, Daddy, put Mama on the extension phone. Remember, in those days, you didn't have 2 phones. You had a phone and the extension phone. And she was upstairs, and Daddy was downstairs. And I said, Mom and Daddy, you'll never believe it, I got a Mellon Fellowship. I'm going to Cambridge. I'm at Mellon Fellowship. And Daddy said, I'm the first Afro-American, remember this is 1973, to get a Mellon Fellowship. And without missing a beat, Daddy said, you're the first Negro to get a Mellon Fellowship? I said, yeah, Daddy. He said, they're going to call it the Watermelon Fellowship from now on. That's my father. So when I came of age as a graduate student, post-structuralism and deconstruction, they were the discourses that were reigning supreme. And my brother, I only have one brother, no sisters. My brother's 5 years older. Paul, he's an oral surgeon. And he heard me speak, and he said, when are you going to write something that Mama and Daddy can understand? And that really, that moved me. And I went down, right at the same time, I was asked to give a talk at an honors seminar at Howard University. I had completely forgotten this. And so I gave a talk called Binary Oppositions in Chapter 1 of Frederick Douglass's narrative, okay? And, you know, I was in my stride, man. I was reconstructing and deconstructing, and everything was cool. And at the end of my hour presentation, I had very polite applause. And then I said, I'll take questions. And a young black man in the back, everybody was black, you know, it was Howard University. I said, yes, sir. And he said, yeah, brother, all we want to know is, was Booker T. Washington Uncle Tom or not? That was a polite way for the tradition to tell me to, as Alice Walker put it, stop talking as if I had books in my mouth. And so I trained my students. We had to know about theory, but you have to know how to say it in a language that your parents can understand. And I think that's a good lesson for all of us. So.
Absolutely.
No, you know, when you're speaking, saying what you wanted to do, what you ended up doing, I suddenly remembered something I'd forgotten for donkey years, that in fact it was to an American university that I first applied when I decided I wanted to study literature. And why did I pick America? I was told that America was awash with scholarships, whereas the British were very mean with theirs. You hardly ever could extract a scholarship out of a British university. So I remember now that as I was leaving school, I applied to, you said you applied to 700 fellowships? I think, you know, Post was quite cheap at the time. So I think I mailed at least 77 applications to various universities. I just got the directory out and started applying. I wasn't the only one.
That's great.
And I got the admissions all right, but not one offer of a scholarship. So I went back to my university college, and fortunately, I was able to get a scholarship, which took me to Leeds. Now, how did I get to Leeds? By the time the scholarship came from my, colonial government, not the British, but who were just moving slowly towards independence at the time. By the time I got the the scholarship, I got that first before I had a place to go to. So the question was, where did I want to go? Now, you know, the three main universities that we knew of, we colonial creatures at the time were Oxford, Cambridge, and London. And my university college was actually part of London. So I said, well, I'm already University of London. So let me try the other two. Tried Oxford, tried Cambridge, mailed the letters. I never even heard from them. So I brought out the map, and I remember I sat with one of my teachers, brought out the map, and I remember he asking me, why are you looking at a map? I thought you said you wanted to go and study English literature. What has geography got to do with it? So I said, well, I've heard about what happens in England, that the sun never shines, permanently cold, but I remember my geography, and I know that the further you went from the equator, the colder it got. So this is a map of England, where my scholarship is supposed to take me. So this is the equator. I'm looking for whichever university was closest to the equator, because that's where I'm going.
That's great.
And I got admitted to Edinburgh, and I got admitted to another one, both of them in the wilds of Scotland. And so I came further down, and well, Leeds wasn't exactly on the equator, but it was south of Edinburgh, and the other one, it wasn't Sheffield. I can't remember now. Aberdeen. So I said, Leeds, here we come. And that's how I got to Leeds.
That's great.
Closest in England to the equator.
I'm also wondering, you've been doing these projects where you're talking to people about their stories. You're investigating their stories. And when you wrote probably one of the most well-known plays that you've written, Death and the King's Horseman, it was reputedly based on a true story that circulated about what happened in colonial times in Nigeria. And you're looking for the truth of a story, and then you're also embellishing the story in some other way.
Theresia is talking about Death and the King's Horseman, and when Wole received the Nobel Prize in 1986, becoming the first person of African descent to get the Nobel Prize in Literature. I was his guest in Stockholm.
What? Really?
Yeah. You want to know how exclusive that was? And the Nigerian government sent a jumbo jet of Africans to Stockholm has never been the same, man. We rocked. The Grand Hotel was rocking when it was fabulous. So I was his student, and in Oxford it's called your tutor, and Cambridge it's your supervisor. So he was my supervisor, and he was introducing me to African literature and mythology. And I'd see him every couple of weeks. And he said, I'm in the middle of a project, and I'll let you know when I finish, but I can't see you until I get finished. In those days, my students can't believe this, but there were no phones. You didn't have a TV in your rooms at Cambridge, and you didn't have a phone. If you wanted to communicate with someone, you wrote a letter, and you put it in the campus mail, and then they would respond. Very civilized, very civilized. And so I didn't hear from him, and then I got a note saying to come see him, and he didn't tell me what he was working on. But shortly after that, he asked if I was free on a certain date, and he had a drama troupe come and to do a reading of this play. And he didn't tell me anything about the play, but there was an African student, and he and I were the audience for the very first reading of Death and the King's Horseman. Wow. And that is the play that he wrote in a week. In a week. This play is so great. 1,000 years from now, people will still be reading Death and the King's Horseman. This is a person who has created a classic work of world literature that is timeless and sublime.
Woo!
Well, I think there are two narratives of interest surrounding this play. The first was how it came about. I'd heard about this it's a truthful story. I heard about it for some time, and I was going to work on it. But we had a Yoruba dramatist, his name is Duro Ladipo, And he wrote and directed, produced a play based on it called Obawaja. And for me, it is such a beautiful play that he wrote. In fact, that play toured. I remember Germany came to the States briefly, I think La Mama Theater, I can't remember now. But anyway, as far as I was concerned, that was the end of it. A playwright, Marymount, had written it in Yoruba and really created a beautiful, tragic spectacle on stage. And so that was it. Until I became a fellow at Churchill College, Cambridge. I used to go down for my coffee every morning, and on a plinth at the top of the stairs was the bust of Winston Churchill, the great colonialist. What we have, we hold. And each time I came down, I just remember the entire history of British colonialism in general, and what, as far as I was concerned, the enormous damage they did to Africans. And I would look at this bust, and there was I enjoying the hospitality of this college named after him. And I had this overwhelming impulse to just give it a shove and send it crashing down. Because this play was about, clash of interest, clash of values, and so on between the British colonial powers and traditional society. So it was an overwhelming test, but I managed to suppress it. And eventually one day, it occurred to me, well, Theological had written this play already, the play about 10 years or so. And this story came back fully. And I had to get it out of my system. And so, these things, when it was ready, it was ready. I thought about it for quite a while before I sat down to it, and I locked myself in my flat apartment. In fact, it nearly got me thrown out of Cambridge. They wouldn't have done it, but at least there would have been quite an incident, because the cleaner, the housekeeper insisted she wanted to come and clean the room. After the second day, she kept knocking. I didn't tell you this. She would knock on the door and insist that I was ruining her work by not letting her come into my room. And I think the third day, when things really got to a pitch where she knocked on the door, I opened the door and said, "Get out of my sight, you racist cow." And she went and reported to the housemaster. And he came afterwards to see me and said, the woman said, I called her a racist cow. I said, yes. I said, because I'm convinced that if it had been a white fellow in there and said, please don't disturb me, put do not disturb on the door, she would not insist. She would not have insisted on coming, knock on the door. I said, so she is a racist cow. And if you like, I would drop my fellowship right now and go away. And after the second story, I had never told you this before.
No, I didn't know
but
that.
I thought it's about time you got
yeah.
properly educated.
Okay.
By me, Anyway, we finally sorted it out. I called the woman and I said, look, I can clean the room. I said, where I come from, I clean my own room. When I tell you I don't need you to clean my room, that means you get off. I can clean other rooms. Full stop. Anyway, I thought my watch to that story.
But the great thing about the play is that you would think a lesser playwright would have made it a play about the tension between tradition and modernity, the Yoruba way of life, the British colonial way of life. But the reason for the outcome of the play, and it has two tragic outcomes at least, is indeterminate. You never know The king is dead. It takes place in 24 hours. It's a classic play, right? The king is dead. The horseman of the king is the leading noble of the court. And his job, he's the favored of all the nobles in the court. Because he lives in order to die. He is to die 30 days after the king is dead. He's the horseman of the king. And his job is he's to dance himself to death. And when there's a full moon, and he is to lead his master, the king, through the gate of transition to the other world. And at the precise moment when he is to transition, doing this beautiful rhythmic death, he vacillates just long enough. And you know that something's going to go wrong on this day because he has any wish that he wants. And the play opens. And he sees a virgin betrothed, a woman betrothed. And he takes her as his wife. So it's the day he's supposed to die. So it's the marriage of Eros and Thanatos, if you think about it. And you know that's an act of hubris. And you know this is not going to go well. And it doesn't. It's so you never know why he fails to make the transition. Because the British colonials are trying to break the door down to keep this savage ritual from taking place, because it's a suicide, right? But he also has tasted the earth. You know, he has the earth in his fingers, because he's married on the day that he's supposed to die. You know, he's taking another wife, and another man's wife. She's betrothed, and you know that this is not good. So that is why he's a genius. And you never know why this guy doesn't die, and ultimately he does die. But as the lady of the marketplace says, "But oh, how late it is! But oh, how late it is!" It's great.
So, Professor Gates, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about how you first, was it through Wole that you became interested in Africa, or could you tell us a story about how you first developed an interest in
I got
studying?
interested in Africa in 1960 when I was, that was my 10th year, I was born in 1950. And that was the great year of African independence. I always forget if it was 16 countries or 17 countries or 19 countries became independent, including Nigeria. And I was in the 5th grade, and I memorized the names of all. We had a weekly, a map of current events that would come. And there would be like 10 stories, and they would put the numbers on the countries. And that was Patrice Lumumba, and Chambe, and the Belgians, and the Congo, and all those other things that were unfolding on the African continent. And I memorized the names of each of the African countries and the names of their leaders. And I thought it was so, well, I memorized it the way that Walter Cronkite said them on TV, or Walter Winchell, or whoever it was. And that same year, in Reader's Digest, there was a story. We got Reader's Digest every month, and Reader's Digest condensed books. Remember those? Mm-hmm. And there was a story in Reader's Digest about a little African boy who had walked across the equator, and had ended up in, I don't know, Seattle or someplace, and been saved by missionaries, and then had been fleeing a war or something. And I was intrigued with that idea of walking across the equator. And so when I was 19, and there was no reason for me to be, nobody in my hometown was interested in Africa, nobody in my household was interested in Africa. And when I was went off to Yale, Yale had a program called 5-year BA. And between your sophomore and junior year, 12 people were chosen. It was very competitive. And if you were chosen, you got a gap year, halfway through your undergraduate education. And I was chosen, and I was pre-med. I was raised to be a doctor. You know, my mother, we're here in the blessed, our room has been blessed already, right? For my mother, God rest her soul, in heaven was the Father, Son, the Holy Ghost, and a medical doctor. You know, that was Skippy Gates was going to be a medical doctor. For Christmas, I got a stethoscope. You know, birthday dissecting kit. And so I went off to Tanzania to work in an Anglican mission hospital. Gates are Episcopalian. An Anglican mission hospital in the central Tanzania, in the bush. And that year, I flew from, you know, in those days, air miles, they didn't have frequent flyer miles, you had air miles. So if Wally's JFK, and that man over there is Dar es Salaam Airport, I happen to remember there are 11,000 air miles between JFK and Dar es Salaam. So, and you could stop anywhere in between. And I had Europe on $5 a day. Remember that book? Europe on $5 a day, backpack, a pair of sandals, blue jeans, you know, 3 books, and $500 for the year. And I went from New York to London to Paris to Amsterdam to Rome to Athens to Tel Aviv to Addis Ababa to Nairobi to Dar es Salaam over 2 months. And then I went out to the bush, and I lived there from August till December, and moved into Dar es Salaam. And I wanted to go to Zanzibar, so I'm at the dock. And one night we sailed a dhow, which is a fishing boat, Arab fishing boat, D-H-O-W. And there was this white guy who had just graduated from Harvard and been kicked out of then Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia. And we met there, and you know, for $1 or something, you could hop a ride on a fishing boat and go to Zanzibar. And halfway to Zanzibar, with this big, beautiful sky, where you could see the Southern Cross, you know, which you can't see up here. I told him, he told me his fantasy was to go from Cape to Cairo, like Cecil Rhodes wanted to build the railroad. And my fantasy, because of that story I'd read when I was in 1960, was to hitchhike across the equator. We flipped a coin, I won, and we hitchhiked across the equator. I went from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean without ever leaving the ground. And this guy who did it with me went to law school and then became an Episcopal priest. And my wife says, it's a good thing he's a priest because nobody would believe I ever hitchhiked across anywhere. But it's true. So when I met him, I had been across the continent, and I had visited 6 African countries, including Nigeria. Just after he was, for those of you who don't know, he was in prison during the Biafran Civil War for 27 months, 24 months in solitary confinement. And I went to Nigeria in February of 1971. And where were you in February 1971?
I think I'd moved because I'd been released from prison then, and I went into self-exile just to get away for some time. So around that time, I was just an itinerant lecturer. I don't think I had a mostly in the south of France, I think in Bellarmine, where I borrowed a cottage from Gerald Moore, and that's where I wrote The Man Died, Prison Memoirs. So
Yeah,
I think
The
I
Man
was
Died.
in south of France.
That's his prison memoirs. So he gets out of jail. He, 27 months, he writes, out of prison, sorry. He writes his prison memoirs, and he publishes them, and they try to put him in prison all over again. So that's why he's in England when I got the fellowship, and we ended up at Cambridge. God works in mysterious ways. Isn't that true?
Oh.
So we're going to take a little tiny break, and we're going to have Betty G, who is the Barbra Streisand of Ethiopia. This is true. Sing us a little song.
So this song is a metaphor, butterfly. You know, a butterfly goes through different stages before she flies away. And as human beings, not just human beings, but countries and everything goes through different stages. But sometimes we forget that we are destined to be butterflies. So it's actually to say, don't worry what's happening today or whatever challenges we're facing. We're just one stage away from becoming a butterfly and flying away. ሆኖ ተስፋሽ ምነው ተመናምኖ እውነትን ተውሽ እንዴት ሐሰት ታምኖ ባባጨጓሬ ውስጥ ግን ሁሌ አይኖርም ስሚኝ ዛሬ ኧረ ቢራቢሮዬ ስገኝ ቀስ በይና ባንዴ መች ይበረራል ሂደት አለውና ኧረ ቢራቢሮዬ ስገኝ ቀስ በይና ባንዴ ነው መች ይመጣል ሂደት አለው ገና ቢያነሳም እግሩን ጨፍልቆ ሊያጣብቅሽ ከመሬት ጥሎ መብረር ግን አለ ጊዜው ደርሶ ኧረ ቢራቢሮዬ ስገኝ ቀስ በይና ባንዴ መች ይበረራል ሂደት አለ ገና ኧረ ቢራቢሮዬ ስገኝ ቀስ በይና ባንዴ ለውጥ መች ይመጣል ሂደት አለው ገና በቀለማት አብደው አበቦች ተከቦ በማዛ ታውዶ ከአንዱ አንዱ በሮ ይታይሻል ክንፍሽ በር በምናብሽ የመለወጥ ህልምሽ ሲላውስ በሆድሽ ታዲያ ቢራቢሮ አይሆን ተቸኩሎ ያልሆኑትን ሆኖ ሂደትን ተጠልቶ ብዬ የምነግራት ልቧን ልመልሳት ከድካም ከጥፋት ግን ልብ ብዬ ሳያት እቺ ቢራቢሮ እኔ ሆኜ ኖሮ ኧረ ቢራቢሮዬ ስገኝ ቀስ በይና ባንዴ መች ይበረራል ሂደት አለው ገና ኧረ ቢራቢሮዬ ስገኝ ቀስ በይና ባንዴ ለውጥ መች ይመጣል ሂደት አለው ገና ኧረ ቢራቢሮዬ ስገኝ ቀስ በይና ባንዴ መች ይበረራል ሂደት አለው ገና ኧረ ቢራቢሮዬ ስገኝ ቀስ በይና ባንዴ ለውጥ መች ይመጣል ሂደት አለው ገና ቢራቢሮ ልትበር ቶሎ ውብ አበባ አይታ ኖሮ Thank you. Thank you.
I had a question that is about this idea of ancestry, which, as somebody who helps other people find their roots and figure out their ancestry, who, for both of you, Professor Soyinka, perhaps first, who do you see as your ancestor? Who do you see as the person that you see yourself following in the footsteps of?
I have a feeling that it's an amalgam of a composite of many individuals, personalities, so on. And my mind went almost immediately to an uncle of mine, whose biography, in fact, I was going to write before he died on me. He represented certain, he was a force, a traditional force, and yet he was quite sophisticated as a Western educated person. He combined in the most astonishing way, shall we say, the best of tradition, whether the arts, whether ceremonials, human relationships, the sense of community, and so on and so forth. And he was the principal of a school I first attended before I went to government college, what you call the high school. I began high school somewhere, finished somewhere else. And you all actually know him indirectly, because he was uncle to Fela. He was father to Fela, and I was my uncle. And he was a disciplinarian. The 2 years I was there, I was happy to get out of that school. He beat the living shit out of me. And it was both as principal of that college and as my uncle, he had double right to beat me. And I think he didn't lack for cause in those 2 years. But I loved him. I admired him a lot. He was musical, and he was also fierce, a fierce anti-colonial. He and his wife, Bere, Mrs. Ransom Kuti, his wife led the women in their rebellion against a feudal tyrant, the Alaki of Abeokuta. I acted as courier among the... So I admired the two of them. But he fascinated me a lot more because there was just something so... He was dynamo in itself, and yet he could be very gentle. And he had a remarkable sense of justice. And his notion of justice was this. If you were accused of anything, he created a court and you had to defend yourself. Even if he was convinced, if he had seen that student actually stealing or beating up a junior people, if that individual, that criminal, could argue successfully and convince him, he freed him. It didn't matter if he caught, as he did very often, because he also had a poultry, as he caught some of the senior boys stealing his chicken, and so on and so forth. And he said, all right, what happened there? If you made a good case, he acquitted and discharged you, and that was it.
Wow.
He was a very strange person. And I admired him a lot. He was just weird. And unfortunately, he died. But because he died, and I wanted to capture that whole atmosphere, I wrote Ake, The Years of Childhood.
Yeah.
He was the inspiration for that book.
Oh, that's
because
great.
I just missed the opportunity of narrating my background through him. So I just stuck to the background, and that was Ake, Years of Childhood. So I consider him a real ancestor.
So what were you doing to cause this good
Warrant
man to beat you?
beating.
All right. Let me tell you how ridiculous the man could be.
I want those stories.
The man had a notion of, first he was into horticulture, nature, and so on. You know, I took after him in that respect. And the football field, or any lawn at all, must be kept green. But not merely kept green. It had to be populated by what he called good grass. There was good grass, not marijuana, and bad grass. And we as school pupils, we had our portions of those lawns and those fields, which we were supposed to keep clean, green, and without bad grass. But I found the distinction so ludicrous. And I would even sometimes attempt to hide the good bad grass on them. And his eyes were so sharp and would home in. I mean, we had several students, over 100 students with their own patches of lawn. He would come to mine. And then, what is that? Just things like that.
You deserve to be beaten.
Ah, come on. Good grass, bad grass. Go ahead. Grass is grass.
He's a character. That's great. And so he was fellow Ransom Kuti's father. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's right. And I love just rambling around the woods, you know, just next to the school, when I was supposed to be plucking the bad grass.
So fellow was your first cousin?
Yeah, that's my
Fellow
first
was your
cousin.
first. What about that for good genes, huh? Yeah.
And I gave him his first turn on a stage, because when I had my Knighted British at the Royal Court Theatre in London, and I had a night of poetry, I invited Flaherty to come and play the saxophone.
Oh, wow.
A compliment to my poetry.
Wow, that's
and that
great.
was his first appearance on stage.
Did he give you royalties subsequently for launching his career?
Well,
No.
British theatre.
What about you, Professor Gates? Who do you see?
You know, it took me a lot of years to realize, but my first image of a writer was right under my nose, my own household. It was my mother. I always already said that my father was a fabulous storyteller, and he was. But my mother, well, 1957, the schools where I grew up is halfway between Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C., in eastern West Virginia, on the Potomac River in the Allegheny Mountains. And it turns out, now that genealogists have, I'm the most genealogically studied black man in the history of the world, and the most DNA tested. Turns out my family on both sides, my mother's side and father's side, have lived in the Potomac Valley in the Allegheny Mountains for 200 years. My family never moved. I'm a Redman on my mother's side, and I'm a Redman on my father's side. So there are a handful of black people there in West Virginia, period, but most of the black people live in the coal fields in the southern part of the state. And this is near Harper's Ferry. And you all know about Harper's Ferry because of John Brown. And so Brown v. Board's 1954. Schools integrated in my county in 1955 without Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King or anything. So I went to the white school starting in 1956. In 1957, my mother was elected as the first colored secretary of the Piedmont PTA, and that was a big deal. And every month, all the black people in town, mostly the women, would get all dressed up like it was Sunday, like going to church, and they would go and watch my beautiful mother read the minutes from the previous PTA meeting. And I would be there, I'd have my little white shirt, my little tie on, and I'd look up at this goddess, you know, reading. And not only did she become the first colored secretary of the PTA, representing the race, of course, she would write the obituaries for all the black people in the Potomac Valley when they died. The newspaper would call, say, so-and-so died, and she would write their obituary. And she would read that obituary as a eulogy in church. And I would, before I started school, I would go to all these funerals with my mother. And if Daddy was off from work, he would go. And I remember one time, and she would just, you know, my mother had the capacity to name the person that you wanted to be in your heart before the world had prevented you from becoming that person. She knew how to sense a person off. And I remember we were walking home. I was just a little kid, and I was holding my parents' hands, and we were coming back from the church. And my father, she called him Gates, and her name was Pauline. And Daddy said, Pauline, you did a good job. You did a good job today. And she said, really, Gates? And he said, yeah. He said, at one point, he said, I started to stand up, open the casket to see if that son of a bitch was still in the... And I laughed, and she laughed, and that was like getting A+ on her eulogy. And it took me years to realize that, in part, the compulsion I have for genealogy came from my mother doing people's obituaries. That was the first glimpse, you know, assessing a life and doing a biography. And in fact, I did my first family tree. I know the day I did my first family tree. It was July 3rd, 1960, because it was the day after we buried Edward St. Lawrence Gates, who was my grandfather, Pop Gates. And my father took my brother and me up to look at his, up to the open casket. It was the first time I was that close to a corpse, which was terrifying to me. And then we went over we buried him. And my grandfather looked white. I mean, he could have passed for white. And I remember standing there at the casket thinking how absurd he looked, because he looked like, we called him Casper behind his back. He was so white. So you can imagine, if he looked like a ghost with blood coursing through his veins, you can imagine how white he looked dead. He looked like he had been coated with alabaster and sprinkled with baby powder. And I just thought he looked ridiculous. And I'm standing there holding my father's hand, looking at him, and I heard this noise from my father, and I thought my father was laughing at how ridiculously white his father looked. And I started to laugh too, and I looked up, and the noise I heard, my father was crying. So I thought my life had ended, that this was the most embarrassing thing that I ever could do, laughing at the open casket of my grandfather. But fortunately, I was, you know, a little kid. Nobody even noticed me. So when I started to cry, right? So it was very traumatic. And after we buried my father, we came back to the Gates family home. And my father took my brother and me upstairs to his parents' bedroom. And we still own that house. My cousin Johnny Gates owns that house. And there's a sun porch off the bedroom. And he took my brother and me out on the sun porch. And there was an armoire there, and he opened it up, and it was full of bank ledgers, because my grandfather was a janitor at the First National Bank in Cumberland. And it turns out he was stealing these bank ledgers and using them as scrapbooks. No. And my father was looking furiously for something in one of these scrapbooks. So he took out 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of these bank ledgers, and he's on the floor, and he's turning the pages. And finally, he finds what he's looking for. And he said to you boys, look. And we looked over his shoulder, and it was an obituary dated January 6, 1888. And it said, died this day in Cumberland, Maryland, Jane Gates, an estimable colored woman. And then he pulled a picture of her out between the leaves of this scrapbook. It was a sepia photograph. She was a slave, he said, till slavery was abolished in Maryland in 1864. And she was a midwife, and she was in her midwifery costume. And he said, she's the oldest Gates we've ever recorded. I never want you to forget her name, and I never want you to forget her face. And my brother and me, my brother and I looked at each other, and that's all my father said. And then he put the scrapbooks, closed the scrapbook, and put all the 6 bank ledgers back in the armoire. We went downstairs, had the repast, and we drove home 25 miles away. And the last thing I did before I went to bed, because I had read Webster's dictionary, and that obituary, remember, had said, died this day in Cumberland, Maryland, Jane Gates, an estimable colored woman. And the last thing I did before I went to bed was look up the word estimable, because I didn't know what it meant. And the next day, after the colored picnic, because it was right on the eve of the 4th of July, on the way home, I asked my father if he'd buy me a composition book. And we stopped at Red Bull's newsstand, and he bought me a composition book. And that night, in front of our little 12-inch black and white TV, I did my first family tree. Wow. I interviewed my parents because I wanted to know how someone who looked like me with my phenotype could have, as a grandfather, a man who looked so white, we called him Casper behind his back, and then how he could be the grandson of a woman who clearly looked African, of African descent, who was this funny-looking person who was something called a midwife. And I was able to go back to my great-great-grandparents on my mother's side, and on my father's side to Jane Gates. And Jane Gates' children were fathered by a white man. And she only told her children that they all had the same father, but she never identified, and never revealed his identity. She took the secret of his identity to the grave. And now, a genetic genealogist, purely using DNA, a brilliant woman named C.C. Moore, has found the identity of my great-great-grandfather, and we're revealing it next season in Finding Your Roots.
Oh my God! Nice. That was a nice wind-up.
So just knowing a little bit about your biography with your mother, I think you called Wild Christian, is that correct?
Wild Christian.
And she was very important to you in terms of your activism politically.
Yeah. Before I answer that question, please, there's something a confession which I want Skip to make tonight. Please remind me about that. Edward, yes, I want to make a public confession.
Are you a priest?
Yeah.
Are you a priest?
Yeah.
Yes.
He's my priest.
Well, I call her Wild Christian because her Christianity was wild. She was on such terms with the supreme deity, whom she called Papa God. And I grew up in a Christian household, and she was a petty trader. But one thing she never joked with was her Christianity. She was also an evangelist, if you like. On certain days, they would all go out and try and convert the market women and the traders, go to the markets, the Bible. And I used to follow them around. I had no choice. And I used to feel so sorry for these people when my mother at the head, they rolled down the holy God gospel on their heads, and I used to watch this. In the market, especially the traditional part of the market, we had all the various the herbs and so on, which were considered, of course, pagan, even traditional healing. But at the same time, you had dried squirrels, maybe, or dried rodents, or bats, or whatever. So you had, different kind of things, and they would home in that very section of the market, which I found the most colorful, the most interesting. I was a disaster as a Christian from childhood, even though I was a chorister. I had to go there. I enjoyed singing in church, but I don't think I ever really was. I think the holy water at baptism somehow was polluted when it came to my. But she was very conscientious in terms of upbringing. She also wielded a good cane. But more than that, we were terrified of my father. He was a cooler, calmer person, but his discipline was worse. And he was also a great lover of cottons and flowers and roses and so on. And I loved helping him tend all those things. So she was great. And she was the lieutenant of Mrs. Kuti, the mother of Fela, when Mrs. Kuti, nickname was Bere, when she led the women, and they succeeded in toppling the Alaki of Abeokuta. And since I was very small, they used me as courier between the women when they laid siege to the palace, demanding the abdication of the. I enjoyed it enormously. I think that aspect of conflict is something which appealed to me. But my mother was right in the middle of it.
Yes. You also have a real deep connection to Yoruba gods and the tradition of.
Yes, again, from childhood, I'm more attracted to the traditional deities. That was possibly due to the influence of my grandfather on the father's side, who was a traditionalist. Before the poor man was converted to Christianity, he just couldn't stand the onslaught any longer, and he gave up his Yoruba name and became Josiah. I think that was the name they gave him. But that really, his belief, his worldview, and so on, resonated with me right from childhood.
Thank God.
My sort of guardian companion deity, because I'm not really a worshipper. I don't worship any deities, but my companion avatar, if you like, or demiurge, is Ogun. Has always been the god of iron, of metallurgy in general, of poetry. A contradiction also, like I am, a lover of solitude, and at the same time, constantly on the active side. Let's put it that way. Don't forget, I want him to make a public confession.
Oh, yeah.
what's your
public
are you winding
confession?
up?
Yeah.
Yes.
Let me read.
Okay, yeah.
Since this is a
Confession.
since this is
Catholic
a
Church.
mentor-mentee session,
Let me drink
I want the whole world to know
Let me drink some
how he deceived me into accepting him as a student. And I'll simply ask him, how is your Muntu these days?
You're terrible. You're terrible. So I get to Cambridge, and remember, I'm going to come back and go to med school, right? But I wanted to go to Oxford, Harvard, Yale, Oxford, and Cambridge. So I got the fellowship, so I'm at Cambridge. So I was going to get just a throwaway degree. Not a throwaway degree, but... So
Great, thanks.
That's good. Yeah, throwaway degree, exactly.
I'd always loved literature. Remember, I had a BA in history, but I took some pre-med courses, and I took tutorials in inorganic chemistry, biology, and physics while I was at Cambridge. But you didn't know that. But
I did not know that.
And I decided to study a new field, which is English. And to get a degree, to get a second BA. And at Oxford and Cambridge, your BA automatically turns into an MA in 5 years if you send in 5 pounds. True story. The easiest MA in the whole history, in all the academy. So often when you see these Rhodes Scholars that master's degrees, all bullshit. They just sent in 5 pounds and they got a master's degree. So remember, I'd already been to Africa. I'd lived there. And I said, I would like to study African literature since I was getting the second BA. And the supervisor at Clare College, Cambridge, said, you're in luck. There is a Nigerian writer who's here in exile from Nigeria. And he's over at Churchill College. So maybe he'll do some supervisions with you. He had been rejected by the English faculty because the English faculty at Cambridge was so racist. They said African literature wasn't really literature. It was anthropology. So his appointment was in the social anthropology department. Isn't that? And 13 years later, he gets a Nobel Prize. My man. Which nobody at Cambridge is going to get. So I got to. This is the confession. So I never heard of him, and I looked at his name. You think he's Polish, right? Wole Soyinka. Wole Soyinka. I didn't know what he looked like. I didn't know nothing about him. So I put that letter, remember, in the mail to Mr. Soyinka. It's Wole Soyinka, by the way. But I didn't know how to say it. And I said, I would like to blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, come see me, and we'll see if this can work out in his letter. So I had got my best dashiki. Had a closet full of dashikis, baby. I had a 2-foot-high afro. I know y'all can't believe this, but I did. I had some light blue sunglasses. I was styling, I was profiling. And we had the one African course that everybody at Yale took, all the black kids, was Robert Ferris Thompson's from Africa to the the transatlantic tradition. That's what it was called. From Black Africa to the Black Americas, and in it was an art history course, and he had 3 slide projectors, and he would show a motif from Africa, a visual motif from Afro-Latin America, and one from Black America. It was a bad course, and it really taught me a lot. But the book that we used was by Jan Heinz Jan, and it was called Muntu. And it is, nobody reads it today, but it was all the rage in the late 60s and the early 70s. And he was a German guy, and he claimed to have looked at all these various African cultures and reduced them to their repeating essence. That there was a transcendent African identity and value system. And there were like 6 or 7 principles under Muntu, like Muntu, Huntu, Ubuntu. I'm making that up, but they all rhyme with Ubuntu, right? So I stayed up half the night before going over to meet him because I was trying to blow his mind, to show him that I was bad, that I was hip on the Ubuntu thing. You know what I mean? So I'm walking from from Clare College over to Churchill College, and Afro's kind of blowing in the wind, and I'm going, Ubuntu, Huntu, Nuntu, So I finally find his rooms at Churchill College, and I beat on the door. And he opened the door. Ladies and gentlemen, it was like that. He opened the door, he looked up and saw my afro. He went, He went like that. And he said, okay, you can come in. And so I go in, and, you know, he's like King Wally, right? I mean, he's the same guy there, but it was 49 years ago. 49 years ago we met. That's what a blessing that is. And he asked me what I knew about Africa, and I told him I lived in Tanzania, and told him about hitchhiking across the equator, and I'd been to Nigeria. But I told him I didn't know much about African literature, but I would really like to learn. And then I was taking on a new field, the study of English literature, and he said, okay. And just when I was about to, you know, reach in my hip pocket and pull out my knowledge of Muntu, he said, you know something? I'm going to tell you why I'm going to take you on as a student. And I said, well, why is that, sir? And he said, because you're the only African American I ever met who didn't give me that Muntu bullshit. So wait a minute. So what did I do? I said, Muntu? What's that? As black people say, I swear for God. That is a true story. I would like to ask Wally to read. This is when Elation Oba is doing the dance of death. And the praise singer and the mother of the market are talking to him, and he's dancing himself into the trance that's going to end his life. So remember, he can escort his king through the passageway of transition to the other world.
Yeah, this is Elation and his praise singer, who's sort of chanting him towards the abyss of transition. Praise singer and Elation. Elation, I love you. Can you hear my voice? Faintly, my friend, faintly. Elation, I love you. Can you hear my call? Faintly, my king, faintly. Is your memory sound, Elation? Shall my voice be a blade of grass and tickle the armpit of the past? My memory needs no prodding, but what do you wish to say to me? Only what has been spoken, only what concerns the dying wish of the Father of all. It is buried like seed yam in my mind. This is the season of quick rains, the harvest. Is this moment due for gathering? If you cannot come, I said, swear you'll tell my favorite horse I shall ride on through the gates alone. Elation's message will be read only when his loyal heart no longer beats. If you cannot come, Elation, tell my dog I cannot stay the keeper too long at the gate. A dog does not outrun the hand that feeds it meat. A horse that throws its rider slows down to a stop. Elation Alaafin trusts no beasts with messages between a king and his companion. If you get lost, my dog will track the hidden path to me. The seven-way crossroads confuses only the stranger. The horseman of the king was born on the recesses of the house. I know the wickedness of men. If there is weight on the loose end of your sash, such weight as no mere man can shift, if your sash is earthed by evil minds who mean to part us at the last, my sash is of the deep purple alari. It is no tethering rope. The elephant trains no tethering rope. That king is not yet crowned, who will peg an elephant, not even you, my friend and king. And yet this fear will not depart from me. The darkness of this new abode is deep. Will your human eyes suffice? In the night which falls before our eyes, however deep, we do not miss our way.
Keep on talking, marching up to freedom